well, thank you all so much
We
for
like
coming
long.
and braving the rainy weather and weariness.
The wiper event.
I know. But we got the hardcore group here live in the room. But as we just mentioned to our panelists, we actually have probably several hundreds more around the world in different time zones watching you guys right now. Probably got at least a dozen things saying, where's the live stream link? So just to let you know that there is a global audience that's very interested in what you guys are about to talk about. And so today we have our Senior Director of News and Social Products, Richard Gingras, hosting the panel. Three very, very respected editors from really prestigious journalistic organizations.
Great, thanks. Whoops. Got to turn this back on. Great. Well, thanks. Glad you're here, and everyone else who's participating remotely. I have to admit that the title of this panel is a little bit more pessimistic than my own view of the future of investigative journalism. And I'm going to just put out a couple of quick thoughts. And obviously, I know my panelists here will be quick to disagree if they do, but that also makes good conversation. And the reason for my own optimism is that with the internet, we have obviously this tremendous ability to for everyone with good thoughts to get them out there. We're not going through gatekeepers. In fact, the very fact that these organizations exist is because we have this extraordinary thing called the internet. Secondly, I think we have incredible new capabilities available to us today to do investigative work. Data journalism being a very key part of that. And actually that's particularly important in a world where big data is increasingly important, and for good and for bad. We see it abused and disabused, and certainly the role of the press in shining a light on how big data is used with big data analysis of its own, I think is really crucial. And in that regard, not only data journalism, but I think we have, as you guys have shown, the opportunity now to actually put out important information in different ways. In past realms, investigative reporting was an article or 5 minutes on 60 Minutes for a story. But we can now do things in different ways. You can, as ProPublica has done, create, in a sense, knowledge utilities that are evergreen and can provide ongoing value to audiences beyond the instance of the article. I think these are hugely important attributes to the ecosystem as it evolves. While not everyone might agree, I would actually put forth that I think the state of investigative journalism today is even today better than what it was 20 years ago. I think there's been no small degree of romanticization of the past performance of traditional media when it comes to investigative journalism. And now we have, I think, many more voices participating and doing interesting things. But even if I'm wrong in my current assessment, I think the opportunity, the potential to do more and do more interesting things is really quite significant. But I'm sure you guys will jump in and tell me where I'm wrong, and I am on a regular basis, as many people in this room know. We won't pretend. So first, I'm going to do just a very quick introduction of our panelists, because then I'd like to turn to them individually and let them say a little bit more about themselves, their organizations, and frankly, what drives their passion in doing what they're doing, and particularly today, because you are really, I think, at the creative edge of investigative journalism today. So we have Robin Fields, managing editor of ProPublica. ProPublica has been around now, what?
Since 2008.
Since 2008, has done a tremendous amount of exquisite work. Won, what, 2 Pulitzers now? just giving an indication of the impact that they've had. So great to hear from you. And I know I've been, in my own conversations with Paul Steiger and Dick Toffel, it's just been very impressive to see how the organization has evolved. And in fact, Dick mentioned to me recently that you guys are actually now making money off of your data, which I'd love to hear more about when we get to that. Alisa Barba is executive editor of Inside Energy. Again, the kind of organization and editorial focus that we wouldn't likely have seen 20, 30 years ago. That focus on an individual and a specific area where people feel there's an important amount of journalistic work that needs to be done. So love to hear more about those efforts. And then Andy Donohue from the Center for Investigative Reporting, based over in Berkeley, which has also done just ongoing superb investigative work, superb work in beginning to evolve the models of engagement, of presentation, of how one builds a credible brand in the world of the internet and works to get the results of your efforts out to ever larger audiences. So I'm really honored to have you all here today. I think it's so important for all of us here at Google to really kind of see the faces and the people who do this extraordinarily important work, who take the risks and toil hard for what is not likely the most remunerative profession you could have selected. So we'll start with Andy, but let's a little bit more about yourself and what drives you.
Sure. So I had a sort of interesting moment in college, actually, as a college journalist, where I was working on one of my first stories and trying to think of some different ways of doing a story. And I had my editor tell me, there is no creativity in journalism. And that was a pretty dispiriting remark to hear as somebody who was just getting started and who was sort of really interested in journalism, but also in trying to think about doing things in a little different way. And what has been, I think, most exciting to me in my career and what's changed in the last maybe 10 years as not that there wasn't creativity in journalism, but it's really being unleashed right now. You just have so many different models, so many different ways of storytelling, and so many different types of organizations and types of reporting and different technology that not only is creativity part of journalism, but it's really, really highly valued right now. And it's sort of part of the lifeblood of everybody understanding that this is how we create sort of the new journalism. So my background is before being at CIR, I was a Knight Fellow at Stanford. And then also before that, I was at Voice of San Diego, which was a startup, one of the first nonprofit startups to pop up. We basically were created because people were very unhappy with the local media in San Diego and had wanted to create a new publication for a really long time. And every time they looked at it, they would get into the costs of trying to print a newspaper, buy all the paper, get the trucks, the gas, all that infrastructure took up 2/3 of your costs. And so it never made sense, and they could never scale it in any interesting way. And then in about 2004, we sort of realized that the internet was ready to sort of hold legitimate news organization, and that for-profit wasn't the way to go because the advertising revenue was starting to decline or going to decline. So we went nonprofit, and that's sort of, I guess, what the model that supports all three of us here.
Yeah, good for good or bad. Yeah, no. So I go back a lot farther than a lot of people working in journalism these days. And I was thinking about this as I was coming up here, but because part of what we're going to be talking about is the tools that we use to do what we do. And I was thinking about my earliest tool. This was 30 years ago, and I was a news clipper in the Newsweek office in Beijing. So that was my first journalism job. And there was this little teeny tool, I don't know if anybody remembers it, where you could actually, you cut through the newspapers, right? You remember those? I went looking for it this morning to bring it. I wanted to show you. You'd clip the newspaper articles and you'd stick it in a folder and you'd stick it in a big filing cabinet. And this was your source of information for stories that you were doing. And you had communism, Maoism, agriculture, whatever. So, and in those days, I was trying to remember, I think it was a teletype machine to send the stories from Beijing. I don't even remember. It eventually evolved to fax machines, and then obviously to today. So Inside Energy, the group that I work with, is very, very small, certainly compared to these guys. I have 5 reporters on staff. One's a data journalist. We're in the center of the country, Denver, Wyoming, and North Dakota. We're covering the energy boom, what's going on there. And we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to make it work. We're public media. We do television and we do radio, and we also do digital, obviously, as everybody does. We have 1 data journalist. And we're trying to go deep into these stories and uncover kind of, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly about the oil and gas boom and what's going on there. We're doing it with a very small staff, and I have some really great questions for you guys when that comes.
Great. And Robin.
I started at ProPublica in 2008 when it was mostly an empty room and sort of an idea for what we'd like to accomplish. And our mission has always been to do stories that have an impact and that spark change. And it's been amazing to see over the 6 years that I've been there that we've been able to accomplish that so much. It's just been sort of an amazing ride so far. We are a nonprofit. Today we are not an empty room at all. We're almost squeezing out of our original space. We're 45 journalists. 10 of whom are basically data journalists and developers. And as Richard was saying, data and data applications are central to our work and central to our mission, in that not only do they allow us to do the stories that we do and sort of quantify things and use tools that journalists didn't used to use, but they allow other reporters to take our stories and localize them. Our Dollars for Docs application, for example, which is just one of them, has been used by something like 180 other news organizations to write stories of their own. And it sort of shows you how an organization that's 45 people, most of them in New York, can have a ripple effect that goes on and on. And I think that so much of our challenge is always to, as you were saying, be creative, cut through sort of the outrage fatigue, the numbness, the noise, to try to do stories that stay with people and do make change. So that's pretty much our story.
You know, as I noted, each of you are in relatively new organizations. I mean, CIR has been around the longest in a pre-digital form, actually. But given that, and given your experience, and given the fact that all 3 of you really come out of traditional media organizations in your backgrounds, what's the advice you would give the LA Times, ABC News, as they struggle with change? Do you have any advice for them?
I think there's maybe one thing would be not to try to be everything to everybody. I mean, if there's one thing that you can, one of the threads you can run through all of us, which is really trying to be specialized and focused in certain things. And that's what you're seeing in all kinds of different startups, whether they be the Marshall Project, which is a new nonprofit startup that's just about criminal justice issues, or if it's Vox, just about explaining things. And even you see the New York Times sort of moving this way now, that they're starting to build more micro-sites. They have a whole cooking site, which has totally revolutionized the eating in my family. They've got the Upshot, which is sort of, election. The internet organizes itself around communities. It doesn't really organize itself around general interest. And so what you're starting to see is just a lot more of, the sort of organizing around communities. And what it looks like is you organize communities, and then maybe if you organize a bunch of them, then it ends up becoming general interest in some way.
Robin, Alisa?
Well, I think that what we were seeing happening at a lot of these organizations, the idea that you could cut your way to the future, I think people have sort of realized the futility of that. And I think that the path forward probably does lie exactly where Andy was saying. I think that it's tough to it's kind of like they're trying to take this giant Lincoln Continental, they're driving down the highway at 60 miles an hour and trying to turn it into a Prius while they're still driving it. And I, in some ways, have a lot of compassion for that, because they still have to deal with so many of the expectations of the past. And also so much of their revenue is still coming from paper. So I guess if I had a business model that would work for them, I'd probably be in a different line of work than I am today. But I don't think that they have the option of going nonprofit and funding themselves our way. So they're going to have to soldier forward in a different way.
Well, and those organizations, you know, the LA Times, the New York Times, all these things, I mean, they're still built on fabulous reporters, great storytelling. And I think that what we have learned, whether you're in the profit or the nonprofit sector, is that great reporting will find a way to pay for itself one way or the other. Whether it's smaller, leaner, deeper, you know, those are the key elements.
Well, so far anyways, it seems that, at least in your efforts, that great reporting is finding a way. But let me go to the other extreme and ask you this. As I said, I have a rather optimistic view from a architectural perspective, but what scares you? What makes you nervous as you try to move your efforts forward?
Well, I'll just say that we are funded right now through a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has sought to foster local journalism centers across the country. So what I'm scared of is when the CPB money goes away. So basically, when our grant funding ends, we have to find a model for sustainability that is going to be something along the lines of what these guys do. But again, we're only 6'7", and we're based in states without a huge philanthropic community. You know, we're not in New York or San Francisco. We're in North Dakota and Wyoming, and frankly, a lot of people in those states don't listen to public radio and don't watch public TV. I think that they call the CUME, you know, the amount of people who listen to us, it's, you know, maybe 5 to 10% on a really good week. So finding sustainability within these local communities is really the nut that we're trying to crack. And it, you know, if you look at, I think large national organizations, which these guys both qualify as, have an easier time of it, frankly, than local nonprofit journalists. So let's leave it at that.
So we're going to actually go to questions shortly. In fact, I don't know, we have the Dory somewhere. The Dory is our internal tool so that anyone can surface questions for this gathering. They don't have to be here in the room. And I'm sure there are good ones, and we'll begin with those shortly. In fact, gladly begin now. If there's a question in the room, we can go right to that. Open this up broadly.
So, given the funding challenges, are news organizations like this whole nonprofit starting to put less emphasis on the exclusive and more emphasis on finding the story, even if that means aligning with competitors? Kind of the way the movie industry, production companies, you know, on one side of the road will team together to put projects together that they're passionate about it. So,
well, speaking for us, we've always been sort of a serial collaborator, partner. We're always looking to partner with other news organizations on our stories. And I think that it's interesting because we've seen investigative reporting, which was once, you know, just perceived as super competitive, only mine, kind of an attitude, change completely into something where we want people to not only partner with us on our stories, we want them to follow stories, do stories modeled on our stories. We routinely release our stories and then put out a reporter's recipe for our stories to, you know, spark other people's journalism. Because ultimately, you know, for us, the mission isn't just to be able to stamp a giant ProPublica on everything, although that's fine. So if you want to do that, go right ahead. But to have an impact in this world, you know, and have a story that makes a difference. So we have partnered probably with, at this point, a couple hundred news organizations, and we're always looking to find new partners. So yes, in answer to that.
I think that's a really important result of this business model, is that when you do talk to funders, they want to know what the impact of your story is. I mean, that's what they're putting money into, and that's what they've funded. They're used to funding other things like education reform or environmentalism, where they do want to see the impact of that. Sometimes it's a fine line to walk. We can't be, political advocates for certain things, but that's generally not that hard to figure out. But what they don't care is who gets the credit, right? Unless it's them. But I don't know, just kidding. We've partnered, even though you could say that we compete for maybe some of the same grants or something like that. Like, we partnered on stories together. But a really important part of that is localizing data, so that when we do a story and we'll get statewide or nationwide data, we are in an active pursuit of trying to find local publications to get that out and do that. And that's just a whole different world in the way that we collaborate than we used to.
Right, and so we, as a small organization, we can take the data from one of these guys if they're doing a big data dive on some story, and we can, not only can we localize it, but we can also, we're in different mediums. So I do radio and television. So a lot of these guys focuses on print. NPR does a lot of radio and television too, but I can put you on NPR, I can get that megaphone onto your story, which is always good.
In fact, I mean, all three of your organizations do in a sense syndicate your content in a quest for larger audiences. And last time I talked to Robert Rosenthal, he was talking about how much effort you put into measuring impact, which I think is a great thing to do. But you, I know, had a question before, which I think it'd be good to raise for the group and see if we can find an answer for you.
Okay, so again, this is a small news organization's problem. This is not probably their problem. So we're Inside Energy is our group. We have our website, insideenergy.org, and we all put a lot of attention into our website. We make it pretty, we make it beautiful, we do a lot of data. Then we also have 7 partners across our region who take our digital content and put it on their sites as well, because they don't have anybody doing this. So part of our mission is to raise capacity, is to take smaller newsrooms and give them news stories that they can put on the air and they can sound better. But digitally, that screws us. We lose our juice when our one story is on 7 different digital platforms. So Google, do you guys have a solution for me? What can I do? I know we can customize all the local content and make it different, but basically that's been a huge problem.
Is in a sense how to maintain your Google juice, as it were?
Well, here's the issue, is that our own website, we're supposed to be serving our partners. We're supposed to make them all look better. Our website, the way we sold it to them, we said, we're just archival. We just need a little place to put it. But we're doing all kinds of digital only content that our partners are reluctant to publish because of the fact that it basically doesn't seem to raise all boats.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, I'll touch on one part of it, and if others have perspective in the room, I'd ask you to jump in.
Does that make sense to you all?
Because one thing, and what I was picking up in earlier conversations, is that issue of, if we're syndicating our content, how do we do it in such a fashion that we as the organization and with the canonical article, in a sense, retain primary value, which, by the way, is not a question that just comes from small organizations. The New York Times, obviously syndicates content, and we've had similar discussions with them. So in that specific point, there are some things you can do. The simplest right now is simply to have your syndication partners, when they're putting your content on their sites, is to make sure there's a no index tag in the articles, which means that we won't crawl that. We won't include that in our index. We'll actually then find yours. There's another tag called rel equals canonical, which you can also use. And ultimately it might be better, but the how that is being used across the industry isn't as clear. Make use of that. But others here might have thoughts about your general question, or correct me if they think I'm wrong in my answer to that specific point.
I had another question, probably not today, but no, since I have this data. Kind of like something big is happening in investigative journalism, at least sensationally speaking, this year podcast, right? And I'm sure everyone's like about that.
I was listening to it on my drive here. Yeah.
I'm kind of halfway through episode 9. What do you think? How do you think that affects, sort of like the industry, especially the nonprofit, public, it's part of kind of like they're trying to raise funding right now, season 2. How do you think that affects others trying to do a similar thing, investigative journalism, local stories, things like that? And, how does that affect your personal process?
First, I'm going to quickly repeat is how does the increased popularity of serial podcasting impact your work? Did I? Serial podcast,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think it's fabulous because, I mean, there's a few different points, but one is just like the way that she opens up and is so honest about her quest and her process is in itself half of what's fascinating about that show. And so that she's just sort of turned a lot of what we do inside out. I mean, we all have, there's always interesting stories about, both of like what you're doing when you're reporting, or also just the doubts you have. I mean, that's a key element of that show is how much she wrestles with what the truth is. And we don't like to admit that, but we're always doing that with the story where you're not quite sure, am I even on this story? Is this guy guilty, innocent? I mean, just to freely and openly grapple with that, I think is really liberating. And I hope that's a key feature of investigative reporting in the future. And then just the quest narrative in general is just such a powerful way of telling a story that we haven't really harnessed very much in investigative reporting as well.
It just basically gives us a new way to tell a story. And I mean, I think that my staff is a bunch of podcast addicts, and they're just like going nuts about it. So now every story is going to become a serial podcast, that's the thing.
Question from the Dory? Oh, question from Marisha.
That actually goes into the first thing I've been wondering here. I sort of have this mythological thinking of how investigative story happens. Like how much time and effort does it take? And how do you know what's going to happen in the series? You don't know. Can you give a little bit of like?
That's the fun part.
Insight into like how that begins.
Well, I think we often start with a lead or a tip or something like that, but the truth of the matter is we may have an idea of what the minimum story would be, but as my boss is fond of saying whenever asked about what's the best story that can come out of this, the best story that can come out of this is one that we cannot even imagine today. And that's what's exciting about it. It's what's volatile about it. And in some ways, investigative stories are always the stories that where the people you're writing about or the thing you are writing about often don't want you to do the story. So there are often stories that are difficult because you get very little cooperation. When people get a call from someone from ProPublica, they kind of know the story is not going to be puppies, clowns, the latest press release. So we're constantly having to overcome that. And the challenges and twists and turns of an investigative story, I mean, to someone who did them, is endlessly fascinating. But the great thing is you can get somewhere way more interesting and better than you ever imagined. The truth is usually stranger than you think.
Can you give a few insights into your craft in that regard? I mean, I often observe, I have several friends who are reporters, and I'm always amused at how good they are about getting me to talk about things that I wasn't necessarily comfortable talking about. And I go like, how did you do that?
Well, I think one of the—
You're not going to tell us, right?
I know my secrets are going to come out. I think that one of the amazing things about a life as a reporter is you're often talking to people on the best or the worst day of their lives. And it kind of, and they do this amazing thing, which is that they trust you with their stories. They trust you with their lives. They trust you with these things that they haven't told anybody else sometimes. I mean, we just brought out this story about Firestone in Liberia and their dealings with Charles Taylor, the warlord. And one of the crucial interviews for this story, a story that was reported over the course of a year, we didn't get that interview until maybe a week or a week and a half before publication. We've been trying to talk to this person for 7 months. And so trust building takes time, it takes persistence, but he hadn't talked about what happened to him there for 23 years. And he finally spoke to us. And to be trusted with somebody's story like that is an amazing and it's an amazing thing and something that you carry with you all the time. Your trust with these people who give you their stories. So, you know, that to me, I can still remember conversations that I had where I remember knocking on somebody's door and interviewing them about something terrible their son had done. And I was talking to this man who, the guy's father, and this big burly Irishman burst into tears. And I was just like, oh my goodness. And that is the amazing part of being a reporter, I think, is those kinds of experiences that you have that stay with you and become part of the story that you then share with other people. So.
But there's plenty of doors that get slammed in your face too. You know, you got the guy bursting in tears, and then you've got, I mean, I remember as a reporter, I worked for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, and I was on the Middle East beat out of Washington. And part of my job was, I don't know, it's probably all before everybody's time, but there was a bunch of hostages being held in Iran and across the Middle East. I don't really remember the circumstances, but my job at every time there was news about this was to call the families and to get a quote. I was just, so there's nastiness too. There's nastiness.
Just to build on that a little bit, I mean, it's interesting how important in these kind of stories, just story selection is, like picking the right stories, because you do spend a year, 18 months on the stories, and it is a high wire act. I mean, it's amazing to me how many different stories I've done that key source didn't come out till right at the end, and you're like, what the hell would this have 9 months of my life been if this person hadn't out of the blue emailed me and decided to talk? And so if you're a daily reporter, you pick the wrong story, that scar lasts for a day, and you move on to the next one. And so actually like figuring out how to pick the right stories and when to give up on one when it's not bearing fruit is really, really tough calculus.
So look, we're going to go to the Dory, and then we'll come back to Maggie. As nonprofit organizations, how do you ensure that donors and their donations never influence your reporting?
It's funny, in my previous life in commercial journalism, we had the same question, but it was about advertisers. So this is an issue that we've always dealt with in journalism. And I think that independence is just something that you prove every day. I mean, I can sit here and say, of course, our donors have nothing to do with the stories we choose or how we do them, and that's completely true. But you'll be the judge of that by seeing what we do and how we do it. We are very, very scrupulous about what strings we will allow to be attached to any money that we take. We would never, for example, take money to do a story, because investigative reporting goes where it goes, and we're not going to be limited in what we report by virtue of promises that we make like that. And we've set up a lot of sort of limits on that kind of thing to make sure that never happens. But again, independence is the proof is in the pudding. So.
I've always felt that, and having worked in public broadcasting myself as well as in commercial media, there is no revenue model, there is no financial support model for journalism that doesn't come with the potential for conflict. It is, as you say, in the fastidiousness of those in that organization to adhere to the principles of how and why you do what you do.
I always say that nonprofit journalism is not any more holy than for-profit. It is just as much dependent on the firewalls and the systems you set up. There's these interesting sort of like sweet spots you have to find, because when you do get grants, people generally want to have an idea of like what kind of stuff you're going to cover. They may fund environmental coverage or or something. So we have to figure out, yes, we will undertake an endeavor to find out the most toxic areas of California. But after that, you don't get to pick. That's a very broad area. We'll look at the data. After that, you don't get to pick what stories we do, who does them, you know, anything like that. And so you can't get like really granular on what stories you're doing, but at the same time, you have to figure out how you can make what you're going to do appealing to donors.
And just one last thought is I think donors or advertisers or supporters or underwriters don't often understand that. What we take for granted and what we know as the absolute basis of funding for journalism, there's a firewall between editorial and fundraising. And I have to say, until very recently, I had absolutely nothing to do with fundraising. But again, this is part of the brave new world, and we're all raising money for our operations as we go. But oftentimes, funders will be astonished to know that they can't have a say in what the product is.
And it's interesting because I think people think that because they're not a for-profit business, that it may not be corrupt, right? Or there may not be a problem in asking for that because they're not like the old car dealer at the newspaper hoping to not get tough coverage. Like they're not making money off of it. They just have a viewpoint. But the fact of the matter is they have a viewpoint and an agenda, and that can't drive what we're doing either. But that's not as black and white or as easy to explain to people.
We're going to go to Maggie Shields. Maggie Shields used to work at the BBC, and this weekend when I was hosting an AMA with Daniel Ellsberg, the challenge was to ask him a question that had never been asked before, which is a pretty big challenge, and she won. So beware.
My question is back on the project. At least I'm kind of interested, given that an awful lot of what we do is focused on big investigations, big investors personally, financially. You're not churning it out by the day. How do you make sure those stories have a life that is longer than a day? And probably longer to be the dollars per doctor, which is a good example of that. And is that something that you now have to start thinking about? Is how do you create these investigations that will last longer than one day?
Yeah.
Basically, I'm going to go with that last part is how do you in your work do work that lasts longer than the instance of the article?
That is a really important question that we're wrestling with right now, because the old model of that even CIR used to do was drop the big investigation and kind of just walk away. And now online, you have to have a community that's sort of ready to take that unless it's just some blockbuster. And so one thing that we're working on right now is sort of thinking of these as investigations in context, so that we have maybe researchers or sort of newer reporters constantly writing about the themes that we've decided are important, so that, and it's public service kind of stuff or investigative things, so that there is sort of an audience built up that's ready and knows we might be kind of interested in these things when the story drops. And then when the story drops, this is an idea that actually the editor at Stephen Engelberg at ProPublica, I sort of stole from him. His idea, or that he had talked about, is what they think about as campaigns, where you really just, you drop the story, but then you have all these other things that come out so that you find ways to continuously be in the news cycle beyond just that one day. And then creating sort of durable and sustainable data, I think, is also a really important part. Like we put so much work into the searchable data apps that we create, that they can't just stand for that one story. They have to have uses beyond what that one story is.
In fact, with if I might, you know, with ProPublica, and this is an example I often cite, you know, you've continued to make available this knowledge utility on the state of dialysis treatment centers, so I can understand which one I should use should I need that help. Does that play a part as well?
Well, that was my project as a reporter. So now you're just like, I'm gonna be like, oh yes, absolutely. We want to create resources both for the consuming public and for the journalistic community that have enduring value and that can be refreshed and renewed all the time. We want to, first of all, we follow up relentlessly on our investigations. I think we've probably done, I don't know, somewhere between 150 and 200 stories about fracking. And I can guarantee you right now that if people are waiting for us to go away on that one, we're not gonna. I don't want to reveal the ending or anything, but that's not going to happen. So that's part of it. And I think for something like we created something for a project that we have yet to do on patient harm that is in itself. We have a Facebook community of thousands of members, and that in and of itself has produced stories. And I'd anticipate that that has a lifespan of many, many, many years. So I think that, as Andy was saying, that there's a lot of different ways that we keep a project relevant and we don't just drop a bomb and run away.
You know, we're 6 months old. I don't know.
A question from the cloud, as it were. What role do amateur bloggers and individuals sharing ad hoc messages, photos, and video via social media play in modern investigative journalism? Does leveraging these sources enable more targeted investments by professional journalists?
You know, I think that from my perspective, that's been more of a resource for breaking news in places that reporters can't get to than it has been for investigative reporters.
But I'm sort of recalling, maybe I'm incorrect here, but I thought ProPublica specifically had around one area of exploration sort of done crowdsourcing.
Oh, we have done crowdsourcing, and we have done, mostly we do a very directed kind of crowdsourcing. We did a project called Free the Files, and that was about political spending on political ads, which at one time were very difficult to track because the FCC at first wasn't putting any of this data online. You had to go to television stations and say, give us your political file. Who did that? Nobody. And then eventually they did put some of this stuff online, and it was in completely ridiculous, undigestible form as these things are in their first iteration, PDFs that nobody could make hide or hair of. And we sort of harnessed a group of more than 1,000 people to basically take that mishmash and turn it into data. And we actually put together a database of more than $1 billion of TV spending in the run-up to the 2012 presidential election. And I think what that showed was that if you can give the crowd an interesting and vital task and give them a way to do it in a uniform and standardized way, that there is potential to use that for investigations and to use that just to inform the public on something it needs to know.
But to the original point of can it stimulate an investigation, I just, you know, what Daniel Ellsberg would say if he was here, and what he said loud and clear on Saturday night was, you know, how do we stimulate more whistleblowing, and how can journalists find other additional ways to, in a sense, ferret out whistleblowing? As obviously the state of affairs on whistleblowing in the United States isn't terribly good, since there have been more.
The federal government stop prosecuting whistleblowers?
Well, which is, of course, his key point, is we've had more whistleblower prosecutions in the last 6 years than we had in the last 100.
Yeah, I think whistleblowers, though, are different than amateur bloggers.
Sure.
And, you know, stuff. That is much more of a pointed, you know, where they may go to ProPublica or they may go to CIR or something like that. We do a lot of, we use this thing called the Public Inside Network, which is a public media thing where we have people who basically signed up to kind of provide us with stories. So this is, again, targeted crowdsourcing of people who are already kind of in your community is something we do a lot of.
Question, Paul?
So with the rapid transfer from the old modes of consuming news to these new form factors and the context of use that comes with their mobility and always available, how is that changing the way in which you package and deliver investigative?
Well, I mean, I think in a very basic way, you know, you're thinking about the mobile phone. I mean, I'm thinking about the phone as I'm editing stories and seeing what it looks like, right? Now, a great narrative is a great narrative, I think, no matter what. And so, like, you know, we have long form isn't going away. But what we've tried to do is give people a lot of different entries into a story. and package it in different ways depending on what kind of consumer, what kind of like condition you may be in when you're consuming it. So we just had a story last week about the dangerous pesticides that are used in the strawberry industry. That's an 8,000 word narrative with 5 chapters, but it's also a listicle of 7 things you should know before you eat your first strawberry. It's also a quick 4-minute animation that is narrated by Roman Mars. It's also a data app. So it's just sort of finding all these different ways, but then also making sure that the first and foremost when we're looking at like what the design is, that it just fits on the phone.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the data sources. What are your usual data sources? Are there any data sources that you wish you had access to? And in general, is it difficult to get access to data?
I wish I had subpoena power. No. But I sense that's not going to happen. But certainly, we use any and all sort of databases that we can get out of state, local, and federal government. That's just sort of the standby. I think Dollars for Docs, which has come up a couple of times, is a database that we made out of, we sort of scraped out of, at that point, I think 7 or 8, and now it's more than that. Drug companies, information that they'd been forced to put online because of settlements with the government, and they'd put it online in the way exactly you'd think they would so that no one could ever possibly understand or use it. So we took all that and we scraped it together and made a usable database out of it. And I think that that's a lot of what we do, which is take data which exists, but make it into a useful and accessible thing, a living thing. So that's, but we will accept interesting and leaked data too. So, if you happen to, know anybody.
It's funny how governments could essentially put half of us out of business if they just made their government,
Yeah.
their data usable.
Well, right.
Maybe I shouldn't say that in public. But
I was thinking the same thing, is that
I think you're right.
we all of us
Sadly.
rely on government regulatory agencies basically for our data, and most of it is so unusable that we are employed to try to figure out what it all means and then to make a story around it. But if they, for instance, if they had a whole bunch of you guys working for them and they really could figure out how to make data useful, then everybody would know.
I'd love to be able to pose that question to our data team though and get back to you. I know one thing that we've struggled with is we do a decent amount of work on farm workers, and there is almost no reliable data because they're undocumented workers who will just not interface with the government in any way. So if you're dealing with sexual abuse, sexual harassment, pesticide poisoning, all these kind of things, there is some data on it, but it's just junk. And so one of the things that we've been trying to play with is how to actually, are there interesting ways to actually just create that data?
Another area which is always sort of a data disaster that is really frustrating is that anything having to do with the courts is chopped up by jurisdiction. And everybody wants to know sort of national things about what's happening in criminal justice, and there's just no way to do it. And forget about the civil system. I think that so much is done state to state that where we really benefit from a national picture. So that's something. I know last year we did something on injuries involving temp workers, and we ended up doing an analysis that had never been undertaken before involving 4 or 5 states worth of workers' comp data. And it's just amazing that that isn't there, that we don't know the answers to these very basic questions, even in the sea of data that we have.
Right, it's sea of data, so covering energy and fracking, and you're trying to compare regulatory climates in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Texas, Colorado, where it's all different, and everybody posts data in a different way if they post data, and that's what we do.
Just sorry to belabor this, but one other thing too, I think in education, there's actually too much data. I feel like that you can find a piece of data to make every case you want. So it's like this cacophony
And the
of
Department
data.
of
Yeah.
Education data is filthy. It's awful. It's the worst data we've ever dealt with.
It's all filthy. Probably our last question, and this, I think it's an interesting one. It's, how do you budget a story cost-wise, which actually reminds me, I worked at CPB about 40 million years ago, and we were funding a series on death and dying, and the key character was a woman who was suffering from a terminal illness, and it was going to follow her until her demise. And her prognosis at the time we started was 6 months, and then it went to 12 months, and then it went to 18 months, which, suffice to say, caused a tremendous amount of angst on the part of the funders.
You're like, there's good news and there's bad news.
There's bad news. So how do you do it?
You really don't. I mean, I don't know that that's politically correct to say, but you kind of let the stories go where they go. And if it's really good, we find ways to pay for it. And if it's really not good, then we try to shut it down as fast as possible. But, I don't think we had a donor event yesterday based on the strawberry story, and our executive director estimated that it cost $500,000. And we had no way of knowing that's what it was going to cost. I don't know. I would hate to know if I came in from the start and said, hey guys, this is going to cost $500,000 if I would have gotten it approved. But everybody kept getting into it and kept getting more interesting. And so it just kind of felt right to keep doing it.
Right.
Well, I think also just to keep in mind, I mean, the single most expensive item in any story is usually the journalist's time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, as you were saying, you don't know how long it will take to do the story, but you're going to do it till you've got it. And that's an unknowable thing at the beginning, as you were saying, but that's the way it's always been. It's interesting that this issue of cost bubbles up to the surface in organizations like ours, and yet it was exactly the same at a traditional legacy organization, but it was sort of hidden in a larger editorial budget, so you didn't itemize these things. But I think as smaller organizations that focus on very resource-intensive work, that question is one that we come up against all the time.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to close with a simple question to all three of you. But before I do, I want to, thank you for your time and your eloquence in being here today. And I also want to say, and I think I can speak for everyone in the room, I just want to thank you for the tremendous work that you do, the passion you put into it. It's hugely important. And I know you do it for higher purposes than making gobs and gobs of money. And in today's world, that's a remarkable thing, and I think we couldn't thank you enough for that. But in closing with that, if each of you have a comment on, again, what drives you? Why do you love what you do? What makes you get up in the morning?
I think this is the best time alive to be a user of journalism. I mean, just the amount of different sources, the way to get it, the democratization of information. That to me, it's just incredibly exciting to be a part of that. I think we're at this incredible moment where journalism completely underwent a revolution over the last decade, but we haven't known where that is going to be going. And we're starting to get a better sense. And I think, as Richard, you write a lot, this isn't a thing where we're just going from A to B. Now we're in this state of constant transformation. And that's really exciting to not just step in and do a job that people have always done, but step in and do this job that it gets to be redefined every day, and you get to be a part of that. Is just incredibly fun.
Yes, ditto, absolutely. All that is awesome. I work with 5 or 6 journalists who are all aged 28 to 32, and they are so jazzed about what we're doing. They're so excited. They want to do serial podcasts. They want to do everything. And it's just, for a legacy journalist, it keeps me young. I love it. And just even from the get-go, even back 30 years ago when I began, journalism is the best job because you come into work every day and you learn something new and you tell stories about it. So, I just love it.
Robin?
Well, I think that what drives me is the same thing that's sort of driven ProPublica from the start. We had this mission statement that when we put it out there, I almost thought it was too much. It talked about doing stories of moral force. And I was almost embarrassed to realize how much I actually believe in that. we're all supposed to be hard-bitten, irreverent sorts, and not allow ourselves to indulge in such thoughts. But actually, I really do believe in that, and I do believe in our job as reporters to bring accountability and to bring transparency to this world. I believe that without that, we can't have our country, as it is. We need to have this information to be citizens. And I mean, as we've seen over the last couple of years with the stories about the NSA and so forth, there is such an important role for journalists, particularly investigative journalists, to play in keeping things the way we want them in this society. So anyway, still a little embarrassed, but still a believer, I suppose.
You're talking to folks at a company that has the motto, don't do evil. So, I think the moral force thing actually registers quite strongly with us. Thank you very, very much for your being here today. Thank you.